Some doors stay locked for a lifetime because they are waiting for the one heart that still remembers how to knock. The old mountain house had been dismissed by everyone who saw it. Realtors called it a teardown. Neighbors said the roof would never survive another winter. Even the county assessor valued the weathered cabin at less than the pickup truck parked beside it. Yet at exactly 11:43 on a cold October night, a 6-year-old German shepherd stood perfectly still before a stone fireplace, his amber eyes fixed on a wall that had not been touched in decades. Ranger did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stared as though someone unseen had whispered his name from the other side. Daniel Walker tightened his grip around the worn wooden handle of an old sledgehammer. His breath drifted through the cabin like pale smoke as the mountain air slipped through cracks in the aging logs. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and the smell of damp pine mixed with dust that had settled long before he was born. Every instinct told him he was chasing grief instead of reason, but every instinct had also taught him to trust the dog standing beside him. Ranger had never asked for attention without a reason. The shepherd slowly lifted one paw and touched the stone. Once, then again. Daniel swallowed hard, raised the hammer, and swung. The impact echoed through the silent cabin. A thin crack spread across the weathered masonry. Tiny fragments scattered onto the ancient wooden floor. Ranger stepped back, ears forward, his entire body alert. Daniel reached toward the widening fracture, brushing away loose mortar with trembling fingers. Cold air drifted through the opening, carrying a scent unlike the mildew that filled the cabin. It smelled strangely clean, untouched, almost frozen in time. His heartbeat quickened as his fingertips found empty space beyond the wall. Before he could pull another stone loose, the story stopped there. 48 hours earlier, Daniel Walker had buried the last member of his family beneath a quiet gray sky in western Montana. At 39, the former Marine owned little more than a rusted pickup, a faded duffel bag, and the loyal German shepherd sitting silently in the passenger seat. His grandmother, Margaret Walker, had left him exactly one thing in her will: the abandoned mountain house everyone else had refused to inherit. His cousins laughed politely outside the attorney's office. "You'll spend more fixing that place than it's worth," one of them joked. Daniel only nodded. He had no energy left to argue. Since leaving the Marines, life had become a collection of temporary jobs, overdue bills, and sleepless nights that stretched longer than the highways he drove. The cabin felt less like an inheritance and more like another burden waiting to collapse on his shoulders. Before Daniel climbed into his truck, the attorney handed him a weathered brass key tied to a faded blue ribbon and a sealed envelope written in careful handwriting he recognized instantly. Margaret's final message contained only one sentence on the outside: "Open this only after Ranger shows you where to look." Daniel frowned. He glanced down at the shepherd resting quietly beside his boots. Ranger looked back with calm amber eyes, as if he already knew the journey had never really been about an old house high in the mountains. It had always been about something waiting patiently beneath its silence. The drive into the mountains took nearly 4 hours, and with every mile the world seemed to grow quieter. Cell service disappeared first, followed by gas stations, roadside diners, and finally the comforting signs of small-town life. Soon there was nothing but towering pines, narrow roads twisting along rocky ridges, and clouds hanging so low they seemed to brush the treetops. Daniel Walker drove without turning on the radio. Silence had become easier to live with than conversation. Ranger rested with his head near the passenger window, watching the endless forest pass by with the steady patience only an old shepherd could possess. Every so often the dog lifted his nose slightly, catching scents carried through the cracked window, scents of cedar, wet earth, distant streams, and the coming rain. The gravel road leading to the property looked almost forgotten, half hidden beneath fallen branches and patches of moss. Daniel slowed the truck until it rolled to a stop before a weathered wooden gate leaning awkwardly against its rusted hinges. A faded mailbox still displayed the name Walker, though several letters had nearly disappeared beneath years of sun and snow. He stepped out into the crisp mountain air, breathing deeply for what felt like the first full breath he had taken in months. The scent instantly carried him backward through time. Summers spent stacking firewood beside his grandmother. Mornings filled with pancakes and maple syrup. Evenings sitting quietly on the porch, while she told stories that always ended with the same lesson. The mountains remember every kindness. Ranger jumped down beside him and immediately began exploring without excitement or hesitation, as though returning somewhere familiar rather than discovering somewhere new. The cabin finally emerged beyond a stand of tall aspens. It stood exactly as Daniel remembered, only smaller somehow. The logs had darkened with age. The porch sagged noticeably on one side. Moss covered portions of the roof, and ivy climbed around the stone chimney. Yet despite the years, the old place carried a strange dignity. It did not feel abandoned. It felt patient. Daniel unlocked the front door with the brass key. The hinges groaned softly before yielding to a room filled with cool shadows and the unmistakable smell of aged timber. Dust drifted through thin beams of afternoon sunlight spilling across worn floorboards. A rocking chair still faced the stone fireplace. A faded quilt remained folded over its arm exactly as his grandmother had left it. An old lantern rested on the mantel beside a framed photograph of a smiling young Marine standing beside an even younger Margaret long before Daniel had ever been born. He quietly removed his jacket and laid it across the back of a chair. Ranger walked inside without hesitation but behaved differently than expected. He ignored the kitchen where Margaret had always hidden homemade treats. He ignored the staircase leading upstairs. Instead, he circled the main room slowly, nose close to the floor, pausing every few feet before continuing with careful determination. Daniel watched in silence. The behavior was not nervous curiosity. It was focused searching. Ranger eventually stopped before the massive stone fireplace dominating the center wall. He sat down without making a sound and looked upward toward the rough gray stones. Minutes passed. He did not move. Daniel remembered the envelope tucked safely inside his duffel bag. Margaret had written only one sentence before sealing it forever. Open this only after Ranger shows you where to look. Standing in the fading afternoon light, Daniel felt the first quiet stirring that perhaps his grandmother had not been speaking in riddles at all. Perhaps she had simply trusted the one soul she believed would never stop searching. Daniel stood beside the fireplace for several long moments, waiting for Ranger to lose interest. The dog never did. His ears remained forward, his breathing slow and steady, his amber eyes fixed on the weathered stones as though they held a conversation no human could hear. Outside, evening settled gently across the mountains. A soft wind brushed through the towering pines, carrying the scent of fresh rain and fallen leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a creek murmured over smooth rocks, unchanged by the passing years. Daniel finally walked to his duffel bag, unzipped the front pocket, and carefully removed the sealed envelope. The cream-colored paper had yellowed with age, but his grandmother's handwriting remained as graceful as ever. For a long time, he simply stared at it. He remembered her hands, always warm despite the cold mountain winters, folding pie crust in the kitchen while humming old hymns that filled the cabin with quiet peace. She had never spoken loudly, yet somehow everyone always listened. Taking a slow breath, he broke the seal. The single sheet inside carried only a few carefully written lines. Daniel, if you are reading this, then Ranger has already found what people stopped believing was real. Trust him before you trust your own doubts. Some things cannot be inherited until they are earned. Do not let fear or greed decide what happens next. Love, Grandma Margaret. Daniel read the letter again, slower this time. There were no directions, no explanation, only faith. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. Ranger quietly stood, walked to Daniel, and gently nudged the man's hand with his nose before returning to the fireplace. It was such a familiar gesture that Daniel smiled without realizing it. During deployment overseas, Ranger had often done the same thing moments before detecting something others had overlooked. The shepherd had never relied on excitement. He relied on certainty. Daniel walked around the fireplace, studying every stone. Nothing seemed unusual. The mortar looked old, but solid. The mantel bore the scratches of countless winters. A small iron poker still leaned against the hearth exactly where his grandmother had always kept it. He tapped lightly against several stones with the handle. Most answered with the heavy sound of solid masonry. One near the center produced a faintly different tone, almost hollow, but only slightly. He frowned. It could have been nothing more than age settling into the old chimney. Before he could examine it further, The distant growl of an engine drifted through the trees. Daniel stepped onto the porch just as a dark sport utility vehicle slowly climbed the gravel driveway. A well-dressed man in his early 50s stepped out wearing expensive hiking boots that looked as though they had never touched mud before. His smile arrived before his handshake. "You must be Daniel Walker," the stranger said warmly. "My name is Richard Coleman. I own several vacation properties nearby. I heard the Walker cabin finally changed hands. I was hoping we could talk." Daniel nodded politely, but said very little. Ranger emerged onto the porch and quietly positioned himself beside Daniel's leg. The shepherd did not growl. He simply watched. Richard glanced briefly at the dog before returning his attention to the cabin with unusual interest. "Beautiful location," he said. "Of course, the structure itself is beyond saving. Honestly, demolition would probably cost more than the lumber is worth. Still, I would be willing to make you a generous cash offer today. No inspections. No paperwork delays. You could leave these mountains by morning." Daniel looked back toward the old cabin behind him. Something about the offer felt strangely rushed. Then he noticed Ranger. The shepherd was not looking at Richard. He was staring at the man's polished boots, his nose quietly testing the air as though recognizing a scent carried from somewhere deep inside the silent house. Richard Coleman kept the same pleasant smile on his face, but there was something practiced about it, as though he had rehearsed this conversation many times before arriving. Daniel had met enough people during his years in uniform to recognize confidence that came from preparation instead of honesty. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine between them while clouds gathered slowly over the distant ridges. Ranger remained perfectly still beside the porch steps, his posture relaxed yet attentive, never taking his eyes off the visitor. Richard slipped both hands into the pockets of his expensive jacket and glanced around the property with unusual familiarity. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said. "She loved this place, but time catches up with every building. I would hate to see you pour your savings into something that cannot be saved." Daniel quietly folded his arms. "You knew my grandmother?" Richard nodded without hesitation. "Only in passing. Everyone around these mountains knew Margaret Walker. She kept to herself, but she was respected." His answer sounded reasonable, yet it left Daniel with more questions than comfort. Margaret had spent most of her life avoiding unnecessary attention. She rarely entertained strangers, and she had never mentioned anyone named Richard Coleman. The silence stretched between them until Richard reached into his leather briefcase and removed a neatly prepared folder. Inside was a purchase agreement with several blank signature lines already waiting. "I can offer $300,000 today," Richard said. "Cash. No inspections. No delays. You would never have to worry about this old place again." Daniel stared at the number. It was far beyond what anyone had claimed the property was worth. Enough to erase every debt. Enough to begin a new life. Yet instead of relief, he felt a quiet uneasiness settle over him. People rarely overpaid for things they believed were worthless. Ranger suddenly lowered his head toward the wooden porch floor and inhaled slowly. His ears twitched once. Then he walked past Richard without acknowledging him and stopped near the front corner of the cabin where an old rain barrel collected water dripping from the roof. The shepherd sniffed the ground carefully before looking toward the forest trail that disappeared behind the house. Daniel noticed faint tire tracks pressed into the damp earth. They were fresh, likely no more than a day or two old. Someone had driven here recently. Richard followed Daniel's gaze for only a fraction of a second before smiling again. "Mountain roads stay busy this time of year," he said almost too quickly. Daniel had not mentioned the tracks. Richard should not have known what had caught his attention. A quiet warning stirred inside him. Years of military service had taught him that the smallest details often carried the greatest truth. Ranger returned to the porch, but instead of sitting beside Daniel, he positioned himself directly between Daniel and the stranger. Not aggressively, simply protectively. Richard noticed the movement and gave a soft laugh. "Very loyal dog," he said. "German shepherds always know who they belong to." Daniel reached down and rested one hand gently against Ranger's neck. The familiar warmth beneath the thick sable coat steadied his thoughts. "I appreciate the offer," he replied calmly, "but I am not ready to make any decisions." For the first time since arriving, Richard's smile faded almost imperceptibly before returning just as quickly. He slid the unsigned contract back into his briefcase and handed Daniel a business card. Take your time, he said. Just remember that opportunities rarely wait forever. As the sport utility vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, the mountains became quiet once again. Daniel looked at the business card in his hand, then at the aging cabin standing silently behind him. Ranger had already walked back inside. The shepherd was sitting before the stone fireplace once more, staring at the same weathered wall. With even greater certainty than before, as though every passing minute convinced him that whatever had been hidden there was becoming harder to keep secret. Morning arrived wrapped in silver mist that drifted lazily between the pines, softening every edge of the mountain landscape. Daniel woke before sunrise, just as he had for years in the Marines, expecting to hear nothing more than the wind outside the cabin. Instead, he noticed the quiet absence beside the old couch where Ranger had fallen asleep the night before. The blanket was empty. He stepped onto the creaking floorboards and found the front door standing slightly open, no more than a few inches. Cold mountain air slipped inside, carrying the clean scent of wet earth after the night's gentle rain. Daniel pulled on his jacket and walked outside. Ranger stood near the edge of the clearing, completely motionless, facing the eastern ridge where the first rays of sunlight painted the mountaintops with pale gold. The shepherd was not watching the sunrise. His nose remained lifted toward the cabin, testing the breeze with patient concentration. Daniel followed him back inside, curious to see whether the strange behavior would continue. It did. Ranger ignored the food Daniel poured into his bowl, something so unusual that it immediately caught his attention. Normally, the shepherd never missed breakfast, especially after long drives through the mountains. Instead, Ranger walked directly to the stone fireplace once again, lowered his head, and slowly traced the base of the hearth with his nose. Every few inches he paused, inhaled carefully, then continued. Daniel knelt beside him and ran his fingertips across the rough stones. Years of soot and dust coated the surface, but beneath one section he felt something smoother than the surrounding masonry. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless someone had been searching for it. He retrieved an old flashlight from his truck and shined the beam across the wall at a shallow angle. Tiny irregularities suddenly became visible. Hairline seams interrupted the mortar in places where they should not have existed. They were too straight to be accidents, too carefully concealed to be ordinary repairs. Ranger gently tapped one particular stone with his paw. Once, then again. Daniel remembered the faint hollow sound he had heard the previous evening. Before he could investigate further, another discovery interrupted his thoughts. Hanging above the mantel was a faded landscape painting he had seen his entire childhood without ever truly looking at it. Today something felt different. He carefully lifted the frame from its hook. The back was unusually thick for such a simple painting. Curious, he examined the wooden frame until he noticed a tiny brass latch hidden beneath decades of dust. Inside rested a folded piece of yellowed paper. His pulse quickened as he unfolded it. It was not another letter. It was a hand-drawn sketch of the cabin's main room. Most of it matched perfectly, except for one detail. The fireplace shown on the drawing was several feet narrower than the actual stone wall standing before him. Someone had intentionally expanded it long after the cabin had been built. At the bottom of the sketch, written in Margaret's familiar handwriting, were only 5 words. Stone remembers what wood forgets. Daniel stared from the drawing to the fireplace, then back again. Suddenly, the oversized chimney no longer seemed like an ordinary feature of an old mountain cabin. It looked deliberate, hidden in plain sight for generations. Ranger quietly sat beside him, his tail resting against the worn floorboards, watching Daniel instead of the wall for the first time since they had arrived. It was almost as if the shepherd knew his part had been completed. The next step belonged entirely to the man his grandmother had trusted to finish what she had begun. Daniel carried the folded sketch to the old dining table where sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating decades of tiny scratches left by family meals, homework, and quiet conversations. He spread the drawing beside a notebook he had found in one of the kitchen drawers and began comparing measurements. His military training had taught him that maps rarely lied. Buildings did not either. If the drawing was accurate, nearly 3 feet of space had vanished somewhere. Inside the stone chimney, he measured the outside wall, then paced the interior. Once, twice, 3 times. The numbers refused to match. Ranger followed him silently, watching every movement with calm patience. Daniel walked back to the fireplace and rested one hand against the cold stone. Behind this wall, there should have been empty space. The question was not whether it existed anymore. The question was why someone had worked so hard to hide it. Hours passed as Daniel carefully examined every inch of the hearth instead of tearing it apart. Margaret had never rushed anything important. If she had concealed something here, she would also have left a way to reach it without destroying the cabin she loved. Ranger suddenly stood and wandered toward the bookshelf near the staircase. It was a simple piece of handcrafted furniture filled with weathered novels, family photo albums, and old field guides about birds, wildflowers, and mountain wildlife. The shepherd stopped before the lowest shelf and sniffed along its edge before looking back at Daniel. Curious, Daniel knelt and removed several dusty books. Behind them rested a small carved wooden box he had never seen before. It was no larger than a loaf of bread and decorated with delicate carvings of pine branches and mountain bluebirds. The lid was unlocked. Inside lay an antique brass compass, a neatly folded handkerchief embroidered with Margaret's initials, and a tiny iron key no longer than Daniel's thumb. There was also another handwritten note. This one contained only a single sentence. Every lock tells you where it belongs if you learn to listen before you force it. Daniel turned the tiny key over in his fingers. It was far too small for the front door or any cabinet he had seen. Ranger quietly returned to the fireplace and sat once again before the same section of stone. Daniel approached slowly, carrying both the key and the compass. As he studied the mantel, something caught his eye. Carved into the underside of the thick oak beam, almost invisible beneath years of smoke, was a tiny keyhole surrounded by decorative woodwork shaped like climbing ivy. He had looked directly at that mantel several times, without noticing it. The opening was perfectly sized for the little iron key. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he inserted the key and turned it. At first, nothing happened. Then somewhere deep inside the chimney came the faint sound of old wood shifting against hidden hinges. It was soft enough that most people would have dismissed it as the cabin settling. Ranger immediately stood, his ears lifted high as he faced the center of the fireplace. Daniel waited. The wall itself did not move, but one of the large stones near the floor slowly eased outward by less than an inch, revealing a narrow gap where no gap had existed before. Cool air flowed through the opening, carrying a dry scent unlike the rest of the cabin, untouched by smoke, rain, or time. Daniel knelt before the stone, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Before he reached toward it, the distant rumble of another vehicle echoed up the mountain road. Someone was coming back, and this time the timing felt far too perfect to be a coincidence. Daniel did not move. Years of military training had taught him that the worst decisions were often made in moments of excitement. The narrow gap between the stone and the fireplace tempted him like an unanswered question, but the growing sound of tires climbing the gravel road demanded his attention first. He carefully pressed the loose stone back into place until it settled almost flush with the wall once again. Only someone who already knew where to look would notice the tiny seam. Ranger watched every movement without making a sound. The shepherd seemed to understand that some discoveries survived only because they remained unseen. Daniel slipped the small iron key into his jacket pocket, folded the hand-drawn sketch beneath his arm, and walked calmly onto the front porch just as the dark sport utility vehicle rolled into the clearing. Richard Coleman stepped out carrying 2 steaming coffee cups instead of a briefcase this time. His smile appeared effortless. "I hope I am not interrupting anything," he called pleasantly. "I figured mountain mornings deserve good coffee." Daniel accepted neither the greeting nor the drink immediately. He simply leaned against one porch post while Ranger settled quietly at his feet. The morning sun broke through the clouds, filling the clearing with warm light that contrasted sharply with the cautious silence between the two men. Richard eventually placed one cup on the porch railing. "I spent some time thinking about our conversation," he said. "I would like to improve my offer. For $100,000. That is considerably more than the property is worth, but I believe preserving mountain history is important." Daniel raised one eyebrow. "Yesterday you said the cabin should probably be demolished." Richard laughed softly. "Perhaps I was too practical. Sometimes old places deserve another chance." His answer arrived too smoothly, changing direction without explanation. Daniel glanced toward the cabin behind him. "What exactly interests you about this place?" Richard hesitated for the first time. It lasted only a heartbeat before he answered. Location. Privacy. The view. Wealthy families pay extraordinary amounts for peace and quiet these days. Daniel nodded politely, yet something refused to settle in his mind. Ranger slowly stood and wandered toward Richard's parked vehicle. He sniffed around one rear tire before stopping beside the driver's door. The shepherd lowered his nose toward the running board, inhaling carefully. Then he looked back toward Daniel. Not frightened, not aggressive, simply observant. Daniel recognized the expression immediately. Ranger had detected something familiar. Richard noticed the dog's interest and casually stepped between the shepherd and the vehicle. "Beautiful animal," he said with another practiced smile. "He seems curious about everything." Daniel replied quietly, "Only when something reminds him of where he has been before." Richard's expression barely changed, yet his eyes revealed a brief flicker of surprise before returning to their friendly calm. The moment passed so quickly that another person might never have noticed it. Daniel did. During deployments overseas, hidden truths often appeared first in people's eyes long before they reached their words. Richard checked his watch and sighed. "Think about the offer. I can leave the paperwork open until tomorrow afternoon." Without waiting for another response, he climbed back into the vehicle and slowly drove away once more. Daniel watched until the dust settled and silence returned to the mountains. Ranger remained standing where the sport utility vehicle had been parked. The shepherd scratched lightly at the damp ground beside the front tire tracks. Curious, Daniel walked over and knelt beside him. Pressed into the soft earth was a small fragment of gray mortar no larger than a coin. He rubbed it gently between his fingers. It matched the color and texture of the stones surrounding the cabin fireplace almost perfectly. Daniel looked toward the empty mountain road, then back at the old chimney inside the cabin. A quiet realization settled over him like the morning mist. Richard Coleman had not come searching for an abandoned house. He had come searching for something hidden behind its walls, and somehow he already knew it was there. The mountain grew quiet again after the sound of the departing vehicle disappeared beyond the pines, but Daniel could no longer mistake silence for safety. He slipped the small piece of gray mortar into his pocket beside the tiny iron key and returned to the cabin, with Ranger walking so closely that the shepherd's shoulder brushed against his leg every few steps. Inside, the familiar scent of old cedar and stone welcomed them back, yet everything felt different now. The fireplace was no longer simply part of the house. It had become the center of every unanswered question. Daniel closed the front door, secured the old lock, and drew every curtain across the windows. Thin ribbons of afternoon light still filtered through the fabric, leaving the room wrapped in a soft golden glow. Ranger immediately crossed the room and sat before the same loose stone, his tail resting quietly on the worn floorboards. Daniel knelt once more and reached toward the hidden keyhole beneath the mantel. The tiny iron key slid into place with almost no resistance. He turned it carefully until the faint wooden click echoed deep inside the chimney. Again the concealed stone eased outward just enough to reveal the narrow opening. This time there were no interruptions. Taking a slow breath, Daniel wrapped both hands around the edge of the stone and gently pulled. It was heavier than expected, but instead of falling free, it rotated silently on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for one person to enter. Cool, dry air drifted from the darkness beyond, carrying the faint scent of aged paper and seasoned oak rather than mold or decay. Daniel switched on his flashlight and aimed the beam through the opening. A small stone chamber appeared beyond the wall. It was no larger than a walk-in closet, yet everything inside looked remarkably untouched. Wooden shelves lined both sides of the room. An old writing desk stood against the far wall beneath a small square window cleverly hidden within the chimney structure, allowing only a thin shaft of daylight to enter. Dust floated peacefully through the beam like tiny stars suspended in still air. There were no stacks of gold coins, no overflowing treasure chests, nothing resembling the fortune countless stories promised. Instead, the shelves held neatly labeled boxes, leather journals, rolled maps tied with faded ribbons, framed family photographs, and carefully organized bundles of documents. A worn American flag rested inside a polished cedar display case beside several military medals whose ribbons had faded with time. Daniel stepped inside slowly, overwhelmed not by wealth, but by the extraordinary care with which everything had been preserved. Ranger remained just outside the hidden doorway, watching quietly without crossing the threshold. It almost seemed as though the shepherd understood this place belonged first to memory. Daniel brushed a layer of dust from the old desk and noticed a single envelope resting precisely in its center. Across the front, written in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For the one who chooses people before possessions." His heart tightened as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was another letter, but before reading it, his attention drifted toward the shelves where dozens of leather journals bore handwritten dates stretching back more than 50 years. Every notebook appeared, carefully indexed. Every box carried names instead of numbers. This was not a hidden fortune. It was a hidden history. Daniel slowly turned in a full circle, realizing that his grandmother had spent decades protecting something far more valuable than money. Outside the chamber, Ranger suddenly lifted his ears and looked toward the front windows. Somewhere beyond the quiet cabin, the distant sound of another engine drifted faintly through the mountains, closer than before, and this time it was not slowing down to admire the view. The distant engine faded almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the whisper of wind brushing through the pines. Ranger relaxed slightly, but did not lower his ears. Daniel understood the message. The danger had not disappeared. It had merely moved farther down the mountain. He stepped back into the hidden chamber and carefully pulled the stone door almost closed, leaving only enough space for fresh air to enter. The tiny room felt strangely peaceful, untouched by the passing decades. Dust rested exactly where it had settled years before, and the faint scent of cedar lingered as though Margaret had only stepped outside for a morning walk. Daniel unfolded the letter resting on the desk. The handwriting was steady, every line written with quiet certainty. "Daniel, if you have reached this room, then you listen to Ranger instead of your fears. That means you are ready to learn why this place was never meant to be sold. What people seek here is not what they think they are buying. The greatest treasures often wear ordinary faces until someone remembers their true names." Daniel lowered the page and looked once more across the shelves. Each box carried handwritten labels instead of numbers. The Anderson family, Thomas Green, Evelyn Brooks, Samuel Carter. None of the names meant anything to him, yet each had been carefully preserved. Curious, he selected the smallest cedar box and lifted the lid. Inside rested faded photographs, handwritten letters, military discharge papers, birth certificates, and newspaper clippings tied neatly together with blue ribbon. On top lay a thank you note dated more than 30 years earlier. "Dear Margaret, because of your kindness, our children grew up with a home instead of fear. We can never repay what you protected for us. May God bless your family as you blessed ours." Daniel read the words twice before carefully returning every document exactly as he had found it. He opened another box, then another. The pattern repeated itself. Every family had once faced hardship. Every collection documented lives quietly restored through Margaret's help. She had become the guardian of stories that others might have lost forever. Yet one shelf remained different. At its center stood a heavy oak chest reinforced with black iron bands. Unlike everything else in the room, it carried no label. Instead, a polished brass plate displayed only a single engraved sentence. "Open only after you understand why everything else was saved first." Daniel rested his hand on the lid, but did not lift it. Margaret had always believed that patience revealed more truth than curiosity alone. Ranger quietly entered the hidden room for the first time. The shepherd ignored the oak chest completely. Instead, he walked to the far corner where an old braided rug covered part of the stone floor. He sniffed once, then pawed gently at one edge of the rug before looking back at Daniel. It was the same calm signal he had given beside the fireplace, never frantic, never random. Daniel rolled the rug aside. Beneath it, the stone floor appeared perfectly ordinary until his flashlight caught the faint outline of a square cut into the rock. A concealed trapdoor blended so naturally into the floor that it disappeared unless viewed from exactly the right angle. His pulse quickened. He knelt and slipped his fingers beneath a tiny iron ring hidden inside one corner. The stone panel lifted with surprising ease, revealing a narrow compartment below. Inside rested a compact steel lockbox wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Daniel gently lifted it into the light. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size. There were no markings except a faded strip of masking tape across the lid. Written in Margaret's familiar handwriting were 4 simple words that made his heart stop for a moment. The truth begins here. Daniel carried the steel lockbox to the old writing desk and set it down with both hands, surprised by its weight. Ranger settled quietly beside the chair, his amber eyes following every movement without impatience. Outside, the afternoon breeze stirred the tops of the pine trees, and somewhere beyond the cabin a raven called once before silence returned. The hidden chamber seemed untouched by time, a place where every object had been preserved with purpose rather than sentiment. Daniel studied the lockbox carefully. There was no combination dial, no complicated mechanism, only a small brass keyhole. He reached into his jacket and removed the tiny iron key that had opened the concealed fireplace latch. It was the only key he possessed that might fit. The metal slipped into the lock as though it had been waiting there for decades. With one slow turn, a soft click echoed through the room. Daniel lifted the lid. Inside were no stacks of cash or sparkling jewels. Instead, he found several thick envelopes tied together with cotton ribbon, a leather-bound journal, a bundle of property deeds, and a cloth pouch containing a collection of old keys, each carefully labeled with handwritten tags. Resting on top was a photograph of Margaret standing beside a much younger man wearing a forest ranger uniform. Both were smiling, and between them stood a teenage boy Daniel had never seen before. On the back, Margaret had written, "Some families are chosen by love before they are recognized by law." Daniel opened the leather journal first. The opening page carried a date from nearly 40 years earlier. Margaret explained that after a devastating wildfire forced several mountain families from their homes, countless legal records, birth certificates, military documents, and land deeds had been lost forever. Rather than allowing dishonest people to exploit the confusion, she quietly gathered surviving copies, personal letters, witness statements, and official records entrusted to her by neighbors, attorneys, and veterans who believed she would protect them without seeking recognition. Over the decades, the collection grew into a private archive that preserved ownership, family histories, and promises that otherwise would have disappeared. Daniel slowly turned the pages, discovering names that matched the boxes on the shelves around him. Each story described ordinary people helped through quiet acts of compassion rather than public heroics. Farmers who recovered inherited land. Veterans reunited with forgotten service records. Children whose family histories had been restored because Margaret refused to let the past vanish. Then one folder immediately caught his attention. Across its cover appeared a familiar name, Coleman. Daniel carefully untied the ribbon. Inside rested property surveys, handwritten correspondence, county maps, and notarized statements dating back nearly 30 years. As he read, the truth unfolded piece by piece. Richard Coleman's late father had once attempted to purchase several mountain properties by claiming neighboring parcels had been abandoned after the wildfire. Margaret had uncovered records proving those claims were false and quietly helped the rightful owners retain their land. The disputed transactions had never reached court because the evidence had remained protected here until every family involved had received legal confirmation of ownership. Richard had inherited only fragments of that story. He knew something proving the truth still existed, but he had never known exactly where Margaret had hidden it. Daniel leaned back slowly, understanding at last why Richard had been so eager to buy the cabin without inspection. He had not been chasing hidden gold. He had been searching for the documents that could finally answer questions left unresolved for decades. Ranger gently rested his head against Daniel's knee, and Daniel smiled for the first time since arriving on the mountain. His grandmother had not hidden wealth inside these walls. She had hidden integrity, believing that one day someone would value truth more than convenience. In that quiet room, surrounded by the lives she had protected, Daniel finally understood that the greatest inheritance she had left behind could never be measured in dollars. Daniel remained inside the hidden chamber until the last rays of afternoon. Sunlight faded into the cool blue tones of evening. He carefully returned every journal, photograph, deed, and handwritten letter to exactly the place where Margaret had left it, understanding now that preserving order was part of preserving truth. The steel lockbox stayed beside him until he finished reading the final page of her journal. At the very end, beneath years of careful entries, Margaret had written one final note. If honesty ever becomes expensive, pay the price anyway. It will always cost less than regret. Daniel closed the journal slowly and rested one hand on its worn leather cover. Those words sounded exactly like her voice. Ranger stood quietly at the doorway of the hidden room, waiting with the patient confidence that had guided Daniel through every step of the journey. Together they concealed the chamber once more. The stone rotated back into place almost seamlessly, leaving the fireplace looking exactly as it had for decades. Nothing on the outside hinted at the extraordinary history resting beyond the wall. Early the next morning, Daniel drove into the nearest mountain town, carrying only a single folder copied from the original records. The priceless collection itself remained safely hidden inside the cabin. He visited the county clerk's office first, then an attorney whose family Margaret had trusted for many years. The elderly attorney studied the documents carefully before removing his glasses and looking directly at Daniel. "Your grandmother protected more than property," he said quietly. "She protected people from losing their identities. These records answer questions that several families have carried for generations." Over the following days, certified copies were reviewed, verified, and compared with archived county files. The missing pieces fit together with remarkable precision. Long-forgotten property boundaries were confirmed. Inheritance records finally matched surviving deeds. Several families received official confirmation of ownership that had remained uncertain for decades. News of the discoveries spread quietly through the mountain communities, not as scandal, but as gratitude. Elderly neighbors arrived at the cabin carrying homemade bread, apple pies, photographs, and stories Daniel had never heard before. One retired teacher remembered Margaret helping a young widow recover land that everyone believed had been lost forever. A former firefighter recalled nights when Margaret opened her home to displaced families after severe storms. An aging veteran placed his weathered cap on the porch railing and simply whispered, "She never wanted anyone to know how much she gave." Richard Coleman never returned to the cabin. Daniel later learned through the attorney that after reviewing the newly verified records, Richard formally withdrew every remaining claim connected to the disputed properties. Without confrontation or public accusation, the truth had quietly settled questions that money alone could never resolve. Daniel found unexpected peace in that outcome. His grandmother had always believed that lasting justice did not require humiliation. It required clarity. One cool evening, nearly 2 weeks after arriving, Daniel sat on the front porch with Ranger resting beside him beneath a sky crowded with brilliant stars. The mountains were silent except for the gentle sound of crickets and the distant flow of the creek below the ridge. Daniel unfolded Margaret's final letter once again and read the familiar words beneath the porch light. "Trust him before you trust your own doubts." He smiled and reached down to scratch behind Ranger's ears. The shepherd leaned gently against his leg, completely content. Daniel finally understood that Ranger had never been searching for hidden treasure. He had been leading one weary veteran toward the inheritance that mattered most, the chance to continue protecting people exactly as Margaret had done for an entire lifetime, quietly, faithfully, and without expecting anything in return. Autumn slowly surrendered to early winter, and the old mountain cabin began to change in ways Daniel could never have imagined during the lonely drive that first brought him there. The broken porch railing was repaired with reclaimed cedar gathered from fallen trees nearby. Fresh paint never covered the weathered logs because Daniel believed every mark on them belonged to the story Margaret had protected. Instead, he strengthened what time had weakened while leaving every memory visible. Ranger followed every project with quiet satisfaction, often lying beneath the shade of the old pine tree overlooking the valley, watching birds drift across the crisp blue sky, as though keeping faithful guard over the home that had finally revealed its purpose. Word continued spreading gently through neighboring communities. Families whose histories had been preserved by Margaret stopped by simply to say thank you. Some brought old photographs that completed unfinished stories inside the hidden archive. Others donated family journals, military letters, and faded maps so future generations would never lose the threads connecting them to those who came before. Daniel realized the hidden chamber was no longer only a place for preserving the past. It had become a promise for the future. With help from volunteers throughout the county, one unused guest room became a quiet reading room where veterans researching family history could spend peaceful afternoons surrounded by warmth instead of paperwork. Another small bedroom welcomed retired service members traveling through the mountains who simply needed a safe place to rest for a night or two. No fees were charged. A wooden sign near the front porch carried only a few carefully carved words. Walker House. Honor lives here. Ranger greeted every visitor exactly the same way. He approached slowly, tail moving gently, never demanding attention but always offering comfort. Veterans who rarely smiled found themselves kneeling to scratch behind his ears while sharing stories they had not spoken aloud in years. Children laughed as he patiently carried tennis balls across the yard. Elderly guests often paused beside him on the porch, resting weathered hands against his warm coat while watching evening sunlight settle over the mountains. Daniel noticed something remarkable. People almost always relaxed before they ever stepped inside the cabin. Ranger somehow reminded them that they had already arrived somewhere safe. One snowy afternoon, the County Historical Society presented Daniel with a framed certificate, recognizing Margaret Walker's lifelong service to the mountain community. Daniel accepted it with gratitude but quietly hung it inside the hallway rather than above the fireplace. The hidden room remained exactly where Margaret had left it, known only to Daniel and Ranger. Nothing inside was moved unless absolutely necessary. The journals, letters, and records stayed protected, waiting patiently for anyone who might one day need the truth they carried. Some evenings Daniel would light a small fire in the stone fireplace and sit quietly with Margaret's journal resting on his lap while Ranger slept nearby. The flames reflected softly across the old photographs hanging on the walls, filling the cabin with a peaceful glow that made it feel wonderfully alive again. Daniel often found himself thinking about the first time Ranger had stopped before the fireplace without making a sound. The shepherd had never searched for wealth. He had simply trusted the quiet instinct that love leaves behind when it has faithfully guarded something worth saving. Looking around the warm cabin filled with laughter, friendship, and restored hope, Daniel finally understood that the greatest homes are never built from timber alone. They are built from the lives they continue to shelter long after the people who first opened their doors are gone. Spring arrived quietly on the mountain, just as Margaret always said it would. Snow melted into clear streams that carried sunlight through the valley. Wildflowers returned to the hillsides, and the old cabin stood beneath a bright blue sky with the same quiet strength it had carried for generations. Its weathered walls no longer looked forgotten. They looked faithful. Every morning Daniel stepped onto the porch with a warm mug of coffee while Ranger stretched in the fresh mountain air before making his familiar walk around the property. He always paused at the same places: the old pine tree, the edge of the meadow, the stone path leading toward the creek, then finally the front porch where he would sit beside Daniel without needing a command. It had become their silent routine, one that required no words because both understood exactly what had been entrusted to them. Visitors continued arriving throughout the year, some searching for family history, others simply searching for peace. They left carrying more than copies of old records. They left believing that kindness could outlive the people who first offered it. Children laughed beneath the same porch where veterans found quiet conversations. Grandparents pointed toward faded photographs on the walls while telling stories that might otherwise have disappeared forever. The hidden chamber remained exactly as Margaret intended, never displayed as a curiosity, never treated as a treasure room. It remained a place of responsibility, opened only when truth genuinely needed a home. Daniel often wondered whether his grandmother had known this day would come. Perhaps she had. Perhaps that was why she trusted a loyal dog instead of a complicated map. Ranger had never been distracted by appearances. He had never cared that the cabin looked worn or that everyone believed it worthless. He simply followed what his heart recognized. One peaceful evening, Daniel carried a small wooden chair onto the porch as the sun slowly settled behind the western ridge, bathing the mountains in soft gold. Ranger rested beside him, his muzzle now showing a few more silver hairs than when they first arrived, yet his eyes remained just as bright. Daniel unfolded Margaret's very first letter one last time and smiled at the familiar sentence. Trust him before you trust your own doubts. Looking at Ranger, Daniel finally understood every word. The greatest guide in his life had never spoken a single sentence. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the valley as church bells drifted faintly from the distant town below. The mountain seemed almost to breathe with the evening light. Daniel reached down and gently rested his hand on Ranger's shoulder. The shepherd answered by placing one paw quietly across Daniel's hand, just as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Neither moved for several peaceful minutes. Nothing more needed to be discovered. Nothing more needed to be proven. The house that everyone had dismissed as worthless had quietly become a place where truth was preserved, memories were protected, and hope found new owners with every passing season. Daniel looked across the valley and whispered softly, "Thank you, Grandma." The wind carried his words into the pines, where they disappeared among branches that had witnessed every chapter of the story. Somewhere beyond sight, the creek continued flowing exactly as it always had, reminding anyone willing to listen that the most valuable things in life rarely announce themselves. They wait patiently behind ordinary doors, inside ordinary hearts, until loyalty, faith, and love finally lead someone home.